First I want to say this video is not meant whatsoever to embarrass my dad. No, I love my dad very much. He has his ways. Now, first of all, when it comes to radio, me and my dad, we're perfect father and son. Anyway, when I was about 13, my dad says, you want to learn the Morse code together. Now I grew up in 1976. I grew up in the CB radio craze. The CB radio craze was heavy. The CB radio craze was fun. Now my dad said this CB radio is fun, but my dad says, why don't you go get your ham radio license? It's going to take study. You got to go pass a federal exam. Now the test back then was more difficult than what it is today. Anyway, my dad was a typical father, a father and son, and always want me to get it first. He said, I'll get my license after you get your license, my dad told me. So he got me the study material. And so we learned the Morse code together in 1976 when I was 13. And we both became experts in it. In 1980, I went in to take my federal exam, and I became a licensed ham radio operator, 1980. And I had my ham radio license, which is federal. I had my ham radio license before I had a driver's license. I got my driver's license in 81, but I was a licensed ham radio operator in 1980. Now, back in those days, you had to know the Morse code. You could not get your license without the Morse code. Anyway, I had to wait a week to 10 days, and the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, federal government from Washington, D.C., they mailed me my license in the mailbox. A week to 10 days, I got my license. Had to sign it. I was excited. But my dad was excited 100 times over, which made him a little hyper, which later on created a little problem. Well, first of all, before I go into that, my dad built me a real nice desk, bought me some radio equipment, and my ham shack was my bedroom. Anyway, now first of all, when I get on the radio or use a computer, I like to be alone. I don't mind somebody in the room with me if you're quiet. You can talk a little bit. Now my dad, I sat at my desk, my dad sat on my bed. He had a tablet of paper and some pencils, and I've talked around the world. As I talked around the world, copied code, he did too. But I was the one licensed, and I was the one only allowed to use the radio. And I've got QSL cards, in case you don't know what that is. That's confirming contact. So let's say, for example, I talk to somebody in Germany. They mail me a card with their picture and call sign to confirm our conversation. I've got QSL cards from Australia, Germany, every country you can think of. Japan, South America, way before YouTube. Oh, I've been communicating around the world way before YouTube. YouTube is nothing to me. It wasn't even thought of yet. Anyway, my dad would sit there. Now, back in those days, if you was a licensed ham radio operator, one of the government's regulations, you had to keep a log, L-O-G. And my dad, being hyper and excitement because his son was now a licensed ham radio operator, made me nervous. So nervous, my first several entries into my log, I screwed up. The timestamp I screwed up. Now I'm worried that I don't know if you mailed them in back then or the government come knocking on your door, and they will inspect. Back in those days, they dropped the log requirements. Now it's just recommended, but back then you had to keep a log, and you had to have your log ready for inspection by the federal government. So how could I prove that was all an accident? My dad just made me too nervous. I love my dad, and I'm glad he was in there with me. But he was excited because his son, me, I was a new licensed ham radio operator. And it was a million times more fun than CB ever thought of being. So I had to get out of it during the day. I got on the radio when my dad went to bed. What I regret in life, I wish I'd spoke up and told my dad, can you be a little quieter? He was just excited, but that excitement caused me to screw up, and I worried about it. I don't know what the penalties were back then. $10,000 fine, a year in jail, prison, I don't know. You got to remember, the log was mandatory if you was a licensed ham radio operator in 1980. So that worry and my dad being overexcited got me out of the hobby during the day. I could only operate when my dad went to bed around midnight or a little earlier. I usually would wait till midnight, get on it 2 or 3 hours. Now I wish I told my dad to calm her down, lay off the coffee. He didn't mean any harm. He was just being a typical father. But what 17-year-old doesn't get nervous like that? And to this day, 40 years later, I don't like anybody around me when I'm on a computer and or radio. If you're going to be in a room with me, you can talk, but monitor yourself. Don't make me nervous. Don't get hyper. What's the word I'm looking for? Don't get over hyper. Let me do it in peace. I don't mind you being there with me, beside me. Oh, my dad didn't mean any harm by it. He was just excited for his son. But caused me to screw my log up. And not operate the radio during the day. So I just got out of the hobby. And I hate that. I'm going back in. I'm going to renew my license. But when I operate radio, if you're ever in a room with me, it's okay to talk, but monitor yourself. Just don't make me nervous, okay?